Good night, everyone. You're on the Cemetery Whispering Channel. Listen to the story to the end, and I promise you won't fall asleep tonight. The Witch's Funeral. This scary story I recorded from an eyewitness. The story is true from beginning to end. Later, I was able to verify this story. The facts were real. The names have been changed at the request of the eyewitness. It happened in a small village in the south of our vast country. The village was founded more than 2 centuries ago, and many families have lived here for generations. The family in question is from the old-timers. Their family had all sorts of things. The youngest son was put away. His mother and father shed a lot of tears. My father, Yegor Petrovich, was respected and valued at work and later in it. He could give good advice. He could repair anything or assemble a tractor from old scrap metal. This fact was even described in the local newspaper. My mother, Anna Alexandrovna, was an expert in labor, over 40 years in the field. The 2 sons turned out to be absolutely different. One can say the yin and yang. The elder son, Andrei, an excellent, exemplary boy, served in the army after school, entered a technical college. In the 80s, he worked for the party, and in the 90s, he went in business and was very successful. Though he did not make friends with anyone, people who know him describe him as not a very pleasant man who seeks benefit everywhere and will easily do a nasty thing to his relatives. He married early to a girl from his native village and had 2 sons. They say nothing good about them. As one of their acquaintances said, genetics cannot be avoided. His youngest son, Kostya, studied poorly, a corridor education, so to speak, but he had a ton of friends and girlfriends. He inherited his father's talent. He could repair anything. Because of his character, he went to jail the first time, then the second time. Strange as it may seem, he was not treated worse in the village. Quite the contrary. The male population respected and feared him, and the female half of the population looked at him lovingly. Except that the young man had already found a sweetheart. He had a daughter, and a couple of months after this happy event, he was imprisoned for a second time, and for a long time. But sooner or later, everything comes to an end. The term is over, the son returned, and the parents breathed a sigh of relief. Life was slowly getting better, despite the hungry 90s. In the village, we didn't feel hunger. We had our own vegetable garden. We had enough to live on. And now a little about Anna Alexandrovna. It is known for sure that her mother was a healer. She treated people and cattle. There were sorcerers in their family, and they were highly respected. One day during the war, a neighbor came to Anna's mother in tears. The cow had fallen ill and was dying, and she was the family's only breadwinner. That family lived on the verge of poverty. 3 children, a little less, and her husband perished in the war. In general, the woman's witch doctor calmed the woman, stayed with the cow for the night, gave her some kind of tincture, read incantations. In the morning, the woman saw a healthy cow and a tired healer. In general, there were rumors in the village. They say that Anna also knows a lot, but does not want to hear fortune-telling, and always her prophecies have come true. As the years passed, Yegor Petrovich passed away. His eldest son was also engaged in business and became a rich man. Kostya and his wife worked for Andrei. In 2002, Anna Alexandrovna suddenly felt bad and was taken to hospital. The old woman was urgently admitted to the hospital, and after they made tests, her relatives heard the terrible diagnosis, cirrhosis. The doctor was very surprised at the state of Anna Alexandrovna. Her organs have literally decomposed, and for a long time, and how she lived in general is not clear. A day later, her grandmother died in the intensive care unit. Only in the morning, her relatives found out, or rather they were called. Daughter-in-law of the deceased told how Kostya woke up around 1 a.m. and reported that his mother had died. It was at this time that Anna really died. In the morning, preparations for the funeral ceremony began, and since it was a hot July, they decided to hurry with the burial. At the morgue, the old woman was dressed for her last journey and loaded into a gazelle. The sons and daughters-in-law were on duty at night, and the house was full of friends and acquaintances. Prayers were read by Olga Stepanovna, a friend and relative of the deceased. It is noteworthy that a couple of months before her death, Anna Alexandrovna strictly ordered her son Kostya, in case of her sudden death, to invite Olga Stepanova to read prayers and vigil at the tomb. In response to questions from her son, his mother only grinned, saying, "You will understand when the time comes." Kostya did his mother's will. In the morning, on the day of the funeral, the weather was fine, sunny, green, all around. Strange things happened next. In the coffin, the deceased looked better than when she was alive, as if she had grown younger. A face peaceful, with a slight smile on her lips. The sight made many people uncomfortable. The priest began the funeral service. Suddenly there was a terrible wind, just a hurricane. The sky darkened. A storm was coming. The few who drove up later said that the cloud hovered only over the house where the funeral took place. The wind increased. There was a terrible downpour, and lightning split the sky in terrible flashes. The priest and everyone else was baptized and praying. The lightning was striking the ground, which looked scary in this area. One of the lightning bolts struck a poplar tree by the gate, and it collapsed on the parked car. Thank God no one was in the car at the time. We began to read the canon, a special prayer of repose. A downpour poured over the eyes of those who came to the funeral, and people were simply scared. A flock of crows was circling in the sky, in the chaos of nature, just above the courtyard. A small underground tremor sowed even more panic. The stools on which the coffin stood trembled. The coffin shook. Everyone recoiled, and a frightened whisper swept through the crowd. "She must have been a witch. A witch gets buried. It always happens. She didn't pass on the gift, so that's how she goes." The whispers grew into a rumble, and the priest looked around the crowd disapprovingly. The weather became even more furious, and a rumble could be heard from everywhere. At last the funeral service was over. The coffin was covered and loaded into the car. In half an hour, the crowd stood at the fresh, deep grave. The last prayers to the peals of thunder were even more frightening. People watched as several lightning bolts simultaneously struck a nearby field. Meanwhile, the coffin was capped and lowered into the grave. As soon as the first clods of earth thudded against the coffin lid, the rain stopped. After a couple of minutes, the wind stopped and the sun began to shine. At the wake, everyone discussed the cataclysm of nature, neither before nor after. None of those present had seen anything like that. The story did not end there. For 9 days, the children and grandchildren went to the cemetery. Wreaths, flowers lay as fresh as days gone by. The flowers should have withered long ago, but no, they were as fresh. After a couple of years, the image on the granite monument began to change. Not only relatives noticed it, but also people who just knew my grandmother. Now she was young on the memorial, though everyone knew what picture was used to make the monument. The photo was taken shortly before the old lady's death, and also on the grave there is no weeds growing. The flowers are lushly blooming. On neighboring graves, everything overgrows quickly. Relatives do not have time to clean it, but Anna's grave is clean and tidy. Such an unusual story of a simple old lady.